Hi, I'm Kate Sheeran Swed. I'm a science fiction and fantasy author, and today I'm reading the first episode in my new series of author-read videos and podcasts, which will be available on YouTube and your favorite podcast provider. I am starting out by reading Outlaw Rising, which is a prequel to the Parse Galaxy space opera series. I'm reading 2 chapters a week through March 16th. And on the 17th, I plan to go live. I'm working out the details, but hopefully I'll be doing that both on YouTube and Instagram, and then I will answer any questions that you might have. So if you do have questions, there's a Q&A form linked down in the show notes. You can go over and submit a question there. This book is actually free everywhere, the ebook, so if you don't want to wait to find out what happens next, you can find the links to your favorite retailers in the show notes. It's available on Apple, Kobo, Amazon, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and most of the major ones. I guess those were all the major ones. So here's what's going to be fun about this series. There are going to be some bloopers. I will occasionally blah blah over my words. But I will also stop occasionally and offer brief asides about the story. I think that's one of the fun things about getting to hear an author's interpretation of their work. When I do have something longer to add, though, that's going to interrupt the flow of the story, I will wait and say more at the end, and that way you can easily skip it, and it'll be a little better that way. Now, this is my first time reading out a whole book like this, especially on camera. So I do shorter readings on a regular basis, but if I'm like dancing a little or starting out slowly, kind of finding my rhythm, then that's why. So let's learn about this together, and I think it's going to be fun. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Following spies was a new gig for Vin, but he was pretty sure they didn't usually make pit stops. And they definitely didn't make them at Vey Station. Nonetheless, Vin found himself tailing a fleet spy through gem-encrusted corridors, trying his best to ignore the way people's eyes widened at the sight of his clothing. Which was perfectly clean, even if it wasn't custom-made or embroidered with real gold, like theirs. Maybe he had a crease or two in his boots. They weren't even torn yet. And maybe the cuff of his shirt showed early signs of fraying, but he looked respectable enough to keep the station security off his back, which should have been enough to satisfy the upturned noses of the snobs who lived here. Who could say what motivated the ultra-rich psychology? He'd call his brother and ask for some insights from the other side, but he was pretty sure even Xander's wallet would fail to impress on Vey. Which begged the question of why a fleet spy would be meandering through here, of all places. The man took a leisurely pace across the station's network of flashy lacework bridges, even stopping occasionally to gaze down at one of the green parks that carpeted the floor below. What information could the spy possibly have to ferret out here, at the wealthiest station in Halloran System, which was located in the wealthiest sector of the galaxy? Vin didn't know. But he was here to find out. Sort of. Vin suspected his employer would remind him that he was actually here to swipe the data the fleet spy had collected. Months of intelligence that would prove, once and for all, that the fleet had been plotting to take over the galaxy, and was well on its way to succeeding. But Vin also wanted to know what the spy was doing on Vey, and if his presence here meant that his operation was not yet complete. There was no use in stealing intelligence if it was missing key pieces of the puzzle. The spy sauntered toward the largest of the bridges, lazily swinging his lanky arms and looking for all the world like he belonged here. The bridge itself looked as delicate as spun glass, but was as strong as steel. The arc swept high enough for another pair of bridges to crisscross below it. No one passing on those bridges even needed to duck. And thank goodness, too, they would have messed up their hair. It seems like a good time to pause and say that the system that Vin is from is also kind of a wealthy center system. Not as wealthy as Vey Station, but his system, Ilia, has a little bit of a rivalry with Halloran, where Vey Station is located. So I'll probably need to get you all a map at some point, but he's a bit biased. The bridges were all blindingly silver, catching the light every time he took a step, and he couldn't help wondering if that's what they'd been plated in. There was luxury and then there was waste. Even his brother would have to agree with him on that. Vin slipped beneath the bridges and onto the grass. He was almost surprised when it didn't bite his foot to chase him back to the path, so he could watch the spy's progress from below. He only needed to get close enough to jam whatever cybernetic implants the spy was hiding. He had to be hiding, so he could get past their security measures and duplicate the data. Without getting caught, of course. That was the key part. Vin excelled at getting in and out of tough situations. His fees reflected that. Subterfuge, though, that was a bit trickier. That required a certain finesse, and Vin was more the crash in, crash out kind of retrieval specialist. He hadn't been able to refuse the job, though, not with the freedom of the galaxy at stake. The spy paused to purchase a bunch of flowers. Even the blooms were bound with a sparkle of precious metals like gold and javan, from a vendor whose clothes were nicer than Vin's, and then he continued on. Even standing directly below the spy, Vin wasn't close enough to jam the man's mods. How that was possible, he couldn't say. Maybe the silver somehow jammed the jammer. It seemed unlikely, though it might explain the spy's dalliance here. Vin sidled out from under the bridge, doing his best to stick to the sparse shadows as he followed the spy's mop of reddish-brown hair down the ramp and onto a path that ran directly beside the park. The spy passed behind a second flower cart and didn't re-emerge. Vin waited, frowning, wondering if there was some sort of hint in the flowers. Was the spy buying a bouquet from each vendor or waiting on a contract? Was he... A hit from behind sent Vin sprawling, face first into the grass. Before he could even twitch, a boot landed on his lower back, pinning him down. He tried to twist, to break the hold, but a burst of electric current bit into his spine, going straight to the nerves and paralyzing his limbs. His teeth snapped together, muscles straining so hard it felt like they wanted to stretch until they snapped. Every muscle, all his muscles, his fingers trying to bend double as his back arched painfully. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't even move. He could breathe, thankfully. His lungs were still operational. His heart was still beating, at least for the moment. The pain was nearly unbearable. The spy bent down, his rusty red hair hanging free over his head and almost brushing the grass. He had a wide smile that would have looked pleasant if you didn't know any better. "Do you know why Vay Station is a good place to stop, friend?" he asked. Vin's jaw was locked too tightly to allow an answer, his neck bent back. Any minute it might snap right in half. He hadn't even landed a hit. The only thing he could think was that he needed to get a message off to his pilot to tell her to run, but his frantic thoughts wouldn't pull up his eye screen. Maybe the spy had fried his network access. The spy winked, then flicked a finger under the almost fraying cuff of Vin's sleeve. "If anyone's tailing me, Vay Station makes it blatantly obvious." And with that, he sauntered away, leaving Vin with his face in the grass, his muscles still contorting painfully. He tried to breathe air past his vocal cords to call for help, hell, to grunt loudly enough for someone to notice him, but he couldn't force out so much as a whimper. He would die here then, struck down in the shadow of a bridge that had probably cost as much to build as his entire home city. Again, Vin is from a wealthy place, so that tells you how expensive Vay Station is. How luxe. As the thought passed through his mind, the electrical current stopped, ceasing so suddenly that Vin's muscles went limp. He grunted in relief as his hands hit the grass. For a good long moment, all he could do was lie there and breathe slowly with his face in the grass. Interesting that they used real soil here instead of easy grow pads. Another breath or two, then he forced himself onto his hands and knees. He almost wept with relief when his limbs actually responded. There was no time to question why the spy had chosen to leave him alive. This was a novice-level botch, a screw-up of the first order, and he needed to fix it. Vin staggered to his feet, the taste of copper hot in his mouth, and lurched out from under the bridge, ignoring the gasps of the richly clothed passers-by. If he paused for even a second, he'd lose his breakfast on a pair of pointy shoes expensive enough to buy a mid-sized moon, and that would delay him for sure. If he'd originally merited sidelong looks from the people on the station, he'd now graduated to full-on stares. His hair must be standing on end, and the prickles in his eyes, Okay, the burning suggested they were wild in the least, if not alarmingly bloodshot. He was pretty sure his shirt was smoking too. The smell suggested as much, but only a little bit. His muscles recovered as he moved, and he picked up speed, ignoring the squeaks of people who hopped delicately out of his path. His communication screen recovered too, and he sent off a frantic message to his pilot, "Be ready." When he burst into the bay where his ship waited, something in his chest loosened. The moneymaker wasn't fancy. It might turn some heads on Vay Station, though not for any positive reasons. But the star schooner was small enough for quick pursuits, roomy enough to make long trips pleasant, and flexible to allow for a good number of custom adjustments. She was long and lithe with ample cargo space, 4 lock-on turrets, which included 2 detachable pods, and a belly that housed a comfortable set of crew quarters. If the old girl had just a little rust around the joints, well, so did Vin. "I told you, you're not spy material," Hilda said as he dropped into the co-pilot's seat beside her. She wasn't more than 10 years his senior, couldn't have been older than 60 at the outside, but he wasn't sure that she knew that. She spoke to him like she was the octogenarian family matriarch and he the misbehaving youngest grandson, rather than the captain of the ship. Her silver hair, which she wore in a long braid down her back, only increased the effect. She'd lectured him long and hard ahead of this job, trying to talk him out of it. Little good that had done. "Thank you, Hilda." The words came out as a huff of breath. Perhaps he wasn't as recovered as he'd thought. "Would you be willing to fly, please, or is it too much to ask of my pilot?" She rolled her eyes, flicked a switch, and the ship shot out of the bay. She'd been a racer once upon a time, and she maneuvered the moneymaker with enviable ease. "Who are we after?" Vin scanned their surroundings, trying to pick out a ship that could belong to the spy. The man might have stayed behind on Vay, hunkered down to hide, but Vin doubted it. He wouldn't have called Vin out like that if he'd just intended to disappear. No, he'd have used the head start to lose his tail so he could deliver his data to the next spy in the chain. Besides, it seemed unlikely that even the fleet would shell out the necessary funds for one of their spies to stay the night on Vay. There, Vin stabbed his finger at the viewport, ignoring the swan-necked yachts and glittering pleasure cruisers that floated gracefully around the station. In contrast to their curving lines, aesthetically pleasing and entirely non-functional, the ship that flitted along between them looked like an ugly cube, all corners and lines. Using the yachts as cover, it drifted away from Vay Station in the direction of the Halloran system's outskirts. Which made sense. The fleet was based in the middle systems, and Halloran was a center system. The spy must be heading home. Hilda cut away from Vay Station in the direction of the cubed ship, which looked like nothing so much as a dropped box of cargo. If the end hadn't been lit with engine fire, Vin might have dismissed it entirely. A good ship for a spy. But Moneymaker's parallel trajectory must have tipped off the cube's pilot, because the ship suddenly picked up speed. It rocketed away from Vay, and though Hilda matched its path, it darted out ahead like a mouse skittering away from a pest bot's jaws. "We have to cut him off before he hits the Halloran current," Vin said. Trade currents moved the ships inside them along at near light speed, making galaxy-wide trade and travel possible. Safe, too, since current technology balanced gravity to protect the human body at otherwise impossible speeds and negated the effect of relativity. Handy, that. Not as instantaneous as a wormhole would be, but no one had hacked that theory yet. What a payday that would be. More on that later, at the end. Unfortunately, currents also made it easy to disappear. Once the spy's ship entered the current, it'd be gone. He could take the next exit and hop to another current. He could ride the wave all the way to one of the outer systems or even the fringes. Hilda cut a direct path away from Vay Station, following the spy cube out toward the nebulous, worm-like cloud that defined Halloran Current. The cube ship was quick, but Moneymaker was quicker, built and rebuilt to give her the edge in any race. Vin opened Moneymaker's comm system and pinged the spy on an open frequency. "Give it up," he said. "Prepare for boarding." Not that Vin was particularly excited about boarding that ship, as he had no security officer currently on staff. It'd just be him and his patchwork army against the spy. Still, Vin wouldn't mind another shot against those paralyzing electrodes or whatever tech had taken him down back on Vey. It wasn't that his pride was wounded, it was just professional curiosity, that was all. Any pilot worth his oxygen would monitor an open comm channel like this, and Vin had no doubt the spy had heard, but the man didn't respond. Hilda banked around the cube ship, preparing to cut it off. Aemlin, the planet Vey orbited, sparkled in the distance off to the left, already smaller than a thumbprint against the backdrop of the universe. The cube dipped, a bobbing pulse of movement that made Vin think of a switch flick, an impression that was amplified when two red lights appeared out of the top like little eyes. "What is that?" Hilda asked. The eyes spun, the red changing over to blinding white so quickly that Vin didn't have time to swear. Double zaps of lightning zigzagged through the vacuum, raging out of the cube ship's eyes, aiming straight for Moneymaker. Hilda dove, spinning into evasive maneuvers, and Vin craned his neck to keep the lightning bolts in sight. They struck the spot where Moneymaker had been, then cast off like they were turning a corner, zipping around to chase after the ship. This guy was obsessed with electric weapons, obviously, or the fleet was. "I can't hold the lightning off," Hilda said, teeth gritted in concentration. "It's too fast." Vin bit the inside of his cheek hard enough that he tasted blood. He didn't know what would happen to his ship if the lightning struck it, but after the paralysis he'd endured on Vey, he imagined it would not be good. Take the current. "Are you crazy? We'll lose him if—" "Just take the current, Hilda." Hilda cursed, then set the Moneymaker back on a straight line away from the cube ship and plunged toward the current. Vin gripped the arm of the seat, certain that his next breath would bring a disabling charge from the spy's lightning bolt weapon. Whatever it was, it looked like it could smoke Moneymaker's systems in one clean hit, from engines to life support. His shields might stand against it, but then again, they might not. He drew a second breath and a third. The lightning chased them, but it never caught up, and Vin had the distinct impression that the spy was herding him straight out of Halloran's system. When the Moneymaker entered the current, the viewport shifted to milky blue, and Hilda released the straps that held her in place. She swiveled to look at him, eyes flashing. "Did we just lose our chance?" Vin saw his own fear reflected in her eyes, his terror at the idea of a galaxy that lived under the fleet's thumb. He forced his fingers to loosen their grip on the arm of the seat so he could drum them instead of hanging on for dear life. No, they're going to hand that data physically to the fleet commander. It's too sensitive to trust their networks, or the spy wouldn't have gone to so much trouble to lose me on Vey. "And how will you know where?" "How indeed. Surely we can get hold of Commander Fortune's schedule. The next big event will be the one. I can smell it." Hilda snorted. "How are you going to infiltrate a fleet party? They just saw your face, and before you open your mouth, I'm not doing it. I can't speak for Alex, but I've got a good guess what she'd say." Vin suppressed a smile. Alex, his science officer, would blow their cover in about 10 seconds, which, to be honest, couldn't be any worse than the way he'd blown the operation on Vey. "You're right," he said. "I can't infiltrate a fleet gathering, but I might know someone who can." Chapter 2. When it came to medical degree specializations, Sloan Tarnish had two equally excellent options. Gene therapy had a huge market, specialties within specialties, big-name donors, all the pizzazz. Nanohealing, on the other hand, featured the more technical options, engineering and biology dancing in perfect time. Both were respectable options, and lucrative too, and either one could help her avoid dealing with blood on a regular basis, a definite attraction, though nanohealing might be borderline in certain cases. Yet both options had the exact same drawback, and it was a big one. They were both totally, completely, and mind-numbingly boring. "These nanorobotic arms were developed right here at Elter University Medical Academy," the lab tech was saying. She might have been a director. Sloan hadn't been paying attention during the introductions. She ought to have, though, because later her father would say, "My friend Linda told me you were in her class today." And Sloan would say, "Linda who?" And then her dad would go off about how she never paid attention. Which was true, only she maintained that it wasn't so much a failing as it was a delightfully quirky trait. Besides, she noticed the important things. They just tended to disagree over what the important things actually were. Sloane's peers would probably agree with him. The handful of students who'd opted to tour the lab were all listening intently to the presentation, some of them typing frantic notes into their flip tabs, others staring at the wall with a concentration that meant they were making silent notes through their eye screens. Yes, the lab was fancy, and yes, she supposed it was responsible for developing some of the most important medical equipment in the Parse Galaxy, but she couldn't see how this tour was supposed to help them choose a medical specialty, no matter how proudly the director, or tech, preened as she pointed out all of her toys. And yet, no one looked excited by the prospect of specializing in medical equipment. Not even Drew Harkness, a slick-haired student that Sloane would have pegged as a future surgeon for sure, or possibly a bureaucrat. The guy had an "I already know it" comment for every situation. He'd also been lobbying their professors for this tour since orientation day, but now that he was here, his comments seemed to have dried up. He looked pale, nervous, just like everyone else in the class. Perhaps they were all here under duress. Perhaps, like her father, their families had insisted they attend all the tours, every single tour. The only thing better than a medical specialist for a kid, an engineer/medical specialist. Oh, the joy. Or maybe they were simply squeamish. It was one thing to know that doctors could unleash cell-sized robots into your body to heal certain injuries or sicknesses. It was another to stare that technology straight in the face and picture it carving a path toward your veins. The lab director or tech soldiered on with her presentation, either doggedly determined to ignore or blissfully unaware of her audience's mental state. She held her hand up palm flat to show them a tiny cube of burnished silver metal. It was too small for Sloane to make out any additional details. This is a prototype nano-arm. It's optimized for manual control. It was the size of a bottle cap, and it still looked too big to send marauding through a person's body. Sloane squinted at it, trying her best not to picture that. Why would you want to control them manually? Isn't it more accurate to use an AI? Drew Harkness shot her a shut-up look, of all people, honestly, but the director tech smiled like she was happy someone in the room had functioning brainwaves. Usually, yes, but in some cases doctors want more control. Always with computer assistance, of course, but if medical AIs could heal every ailment without human intervention, we wouldn't need doctors. Sounded to Sloane like some strong, I want to keep my job propaganda, but okay. The director tech opened her mouth to say something else, then paused, frowning down at the tiny technology, as opposed to a technician. I'm sorry, she said. This one had a malfunction earlier. Let me go snag the toolkit we used to fix them. They need a special adhesive because they're sensitive to heat. You can see a workshop firsthand. She bustled out of the room so quickly that Sloane wondered if she thought they'd run out on her while she was gone. Drew Harkness was bending over the prototype, his thickly greased hair coming dangerously close to brushing it. It doesn't look broken. More because she was tired of the know-it-all than because she cared, Sloane leaned in next to him. She wasn't the best with tech, but she could see that the arm was tilting on its base. She pointed to the spot. I could fix that. Drew snorted. No, you couldn't. Sure I could. And how would you propose to do that? He was awfully confident for a person who just denied the arm even looked broken. She refused to back down, instead meeting his gaze head-on. I could fix it with Javen. At that, Drew actually threw his head back and laughed. It was such a practiced move that Sloane almost felt sorry for him, that he acted so much like a fledgling supervillain in a cheesy vid. Javen, he said? What, you don't have any solid gold? No diamonds? Drew wasn't the only one who was laughing. The other students were a bit more polite about it, hiding their giggles behind their hands or trying admirably to keep it to a smirk, but they were laughing. See, this was why Sloane tended to stay to the back of the class. The front of the party scene, sure, but the back of the class. That and the fact that she was a few years older than most of them. The older student thing might look fine on them, on someone else. Mature, but Sloane suggested it only made her seem, well, lost if she had to guess. But she could fix the nano-arm with Javen, and before she quite realized what she was doing, she'd unclasped her necklace and held a hand out to Drew. Give me a lighter, she said. Drew sobered, but he left an ugly twist in his lips that said he was a beat away from laughing at her again, or maybe placing a call to her father. But he couldn't deny that he had a lighter, since he was always smoking torque fruit shell rolls outside the bars with his friends. He dug it out of his pocket and handed it to her. I suppose you brought a kiln? She didn't smile. A potato would be better, actually. I bet Glenn brought one for lunch, didn't you? There was a beat of incredulous silence, followed by the rustling sound of something being passed from the back of the crowd. And her father said she didn't notice the important things. Sloane used a scalpel from the table to split the potato in half, then scooped a small hole into the center. Dangling her necklace over the depression and trying not to think too hard about how ridiculous she looked, Sloane held Drew's lighter under the silvery green charm and struck up the flame. Javen has a really low melting point, she said, but not low enough to melt from just a little flame. When you add the starch of the potato, though... Sloane dropped the charm into the potato and restarted the lighter. It actually lowers the melting point of the metal. Something about the starch, I think. 1 second, then 2, and she had a beautiful potato full of melted Javen, the precious metal's signature mossy green threads swirling through a tiny lake of silver. She shut off the flame and the swirling slowed, the liquid already gelling as the temperature dropped. Quickly, Sloane dripped the tip of the scalpel into the Javen. She hadn't taken the time to look for other tools, and applied a generous portion of it to the base of the nanorobotic arm. Using a fingernail to right the tilted arm, she held it in place. The lab door slid open, and the director tech reappeared. I'm sorry, it just took me a minute to find the... What are you doing? The look on the woman's face might have been comical, eyes wide, jaw dropped in a perfect O shape, if Sloane hadn't recognized it as the kind of incredulous shock that came right before a call to her father. Or, in this case, probably the dean, who would then call her father. Sloane removed her finger from the robotic arm. It stayed. I fixed your tech for you, she said. Sloane might have thought Professor Camden was attractive, with his salt and pepper hair, neatly clipped beard, and the hawkish yet distinguished tilt of his nose. She might have, had he not been staring down his nose at her like she was a pebble that he'd just shaken out of his shoe. Okay, not his shoe, his award-winning, world-saving, token-producing medical equipment lab. He was sitting behind a desk that honestly belonged in a castle rather than a medical professor's office. It was made of some dark red wood and it barely fit in the room, yet the distance between his throne-like chair and her squeaky guest chair on the other side of the desk still felt like the vast expanse of space. Explain to me, Professor Camden said, why I've got an experimental nanorobotic arm that's now held together with 500,000 tokens worth of soldered Javen that the Academy is gonna have to name a wing after your father to make up for. He said it all in one breath, which was actually kind of incredible. I can't say it all in one breath, so I said it slowly. I told you I'm new to this. Sloane started to bite her lip, then decided to refrain. She didn't need to broadcast her nerves everywhere. I honestly doubt it was worth that much. Camden laced his fingers together with a deep breath that said he was trying very, very hard not to clench them. Including the rest of the necklace you destroyed, then. Oh, well, in that case. Skraler uses Javen for adhesive, she said. I thought it would translate. And the look on Drew Harkness' face had been priceless, unlike the cost of the Javen, which apparently had a very specific token amount attached to it. Professor Camden tilted his head slightly like he was trying to understand her. A show, of course, but she couldn't really fault him for it. I don't know what a Skraler is, but who? Camden blinked. Slowly. Dramatically. Excuse me? Skraler isn't an it. He's a he. Camden laced his fingers together, squeezing them hard enough to make them go white. I don't know who Skraler is, then. But if he uses Javen to make his medtech, he's got wealthier investors than I do. Probably, but not for the reasons Camden thought. How anyone could not know Skraler, Sloane didn't understand. But for once she finally managed to activate her verbal filter, which was typically fritzy at best, and refrained from telling him that. Skraler is an artist, she said patiently, not a medical developer. He's a sculptor. And you, Miss Tarnish, chose to study medicine, not art. Didn't she know it? Sloane touched her fingertip to the edge of the desk. Either people valued art or they didn't. There was no point waxing poetical over the sculptor's brilliance when Professor Camden didn't have the sophistication to appreciate it. Besides, there was really only one question she wanted the answer to. Did it work? Camden rolled his lips together, and she could imagine him biting down on them hard. Clearly, he was still exercising that try to understand the students instead of screaming at them skill. He must have taken a course on it or something. Did what work? The adhesive. Did it fix the nanorobotic arm? He inhaled, then exhaled, then inhaled again, like he had a cheap guided meditation going on in his eye screen. That's not the point. So yes, then. Camden stood, dropping his hands to his waist. Conversation over, sentencing imminent. It doesn't matter who your father is, Miss Tarnish, he said. You can't go around treating priceless Academia property like a craft project. It mattered a little, she suspected, but she kept that thought to herself. She didn't rise, though it meant the professor was now towering over her. There was still a mega desk between them after all. Am I out? She couldn't be. She wasn't, and she refused to leave this chair until he told her she could stay. She wouldn't threaten to call her father, no. She needed to be able to tell him she'd fixed this on her own. She held her breath. Probation, Camden said. He pointed to the door. Probation. She could work with that. Sloane popped to her feet, gave the professor a wave, and beelined it out of his office before he decided to change his mind. If she was lucky, she'd have a chance to frame the story herself before he got around to calling her father. She'd always wondered if people with non-dignitary fathers got to strike out on their own at some point, but she suspected she'd never know. As she burst out of the professor's office building and onto the academy grounds, she'd never been more grateful for Elter's sunshine. There was an edge of chill in the air today, but the sun filtered down through the tree branches like polished javan, really, and the whole campus smelled like leaves and freshly cut grass. She shouldn't have been surprised that Professor Camden didn't know about Skraler, or that none of her classmates had snapped their fingers in recognition when she'd used the artist's technique to fix a bit of state-of-the-art medical equipment. She'd given up contemporary art to study medicine, to make more of a difference in the galaxy, or whatever. Okay, maybe she could have asked before she tried it, should have even, but she doubted they'd let her come anywhere near the stuff. At least their tech was prettier now. She should drop a note to the director. She had been the director, it turned out, to remind her not to try melting the javan without potato shavings or some kind of starch. She was so lost in her thoughts that when a figure stepped out from behind a tree to fall into step beside her, she actually stumbled in surprise. But she was startled for only a moment because she knew him. His hair was dark like hers, if a bit less fashionably cut, and his smile set off the same mid-cheek dimple, albeit with a few more wrinkles around it. Hey, kid, Uncle Vin said. Got time for a drink? So I hope you enjoyed the first two chapters of Outlaw Rising. This is really fun, and I'm excited. So make sure to subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss the next episode, and hit that little alarm key so that if you're on YouTube, so you'll get the notification. I did want to add a quick note about the currents, which are mentioned in the first chapter with Vin. The spy kind of chases him out of Halloran system. That is a method of very fast travel that they have in the Parse Galaxy. It's a bit of a mystery. They're not really sure where it came from. They think it's technology. But it's definitely on the faster than light scale. And the currents become very important later on in the series. Now, while I was reading, I said Vin mentions that wormhole tech would be a real cool feat for them to accomplish. And it's actually really important in my other series, which is the League of Independent Operatives. Sloane and her friends show up there too. And as I was reading, I was like, oh, I'm going to say more about that. But then I realized it's kind of a spoiler, so I'm going to keep it in my pocket for now. But you could certainly look into that, or I could make a spoiler video later about it if anyone's curious. Those are kind of superhero-y books, and they are connected to the space operas, but sort of loosely. So that's all for this week. Check for all the links in the show notes. Again, this ebook is free, so if you're really hooked and you want to know what happens next, you can go pick that up. And again, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell on YouTube so that you will not miss the next chapter, and I will see you next week.